Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah. And welcome to this week's Torah Portion CHAYEI SARAH, which means the life of Sarah. That's very interesting because it's about the life of Sarah, but she's dead. So the story goes into different aspects of what happens after her death. We know that from the previous chapter, we've had the binding of the sacrifice of Isaac, that's in Genesis 22. And so now we've moved into Genesis 23. And this is going to take place at the tomb of the patriarchs. So Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is just outside of Hebron. And Hebron is south of Jerusalem in the Judean hills, and it is the oldest continuing occupied city in the world. It's the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of course their brides Sarah, Rivkah, Rebekah, and Leah. This is the place where David ruled for 7 years. And as we get into this Torah portion, I want to sort of set the stage for the concept of house building. I'll talk about that in just a second. Because the patriarchs and matriarchs are basically what formed the house of Israel. Now later on, Joshua gave Hebron to Caleb. You'll remember that Caleb came into he was from the Kenizzites, but he actually came in to become the tribal leader of the tribe of Judah, which is very interesting. This area is part of the southern kingdom, that is Judah, and it was so until the Babylonians came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and the children of Israel exiled into Babylon. Now, recently, UNESCO actually made Hebron a World Heritage Site for the Palestinians, and of course, that's another story. But as we can see as we're talking here, it was established long ago, and it's an important place. And as we go through this Torah portion, we're going to see how basically it had something to do with the Garden of Eden. Now, I would like to, as I go through these Torah portions this year, I'm going to take a different tack. And I want to try to bring some foundational material to help us understand. I'm going to look at it in an entirely different light, and I'm going to filter it through the creation week. So I'm obviously not going through the entire creation week here, but I want to make some points that as we go through these Torah portions, I'm going to draw out, and it'll become obvious as we go through this one in particular. So the creation concept, the creation week, I just want to plant in your head, is the idea of creation or building a house. And so when a house is rebuilt, we would call it new creation. So for example, when the temple was destroyed, the first temple was destroyed, and the second temple was built, we would call that new creation. So creation establishes a house built, new creation is a house rebuilt. The temple in the ancient world was the place that brought order out of chaos. And so you find this all over the ancient writings that as dry ground appeared, as enemies were defeated, a house could be built and the king could be established on the throne. So again, the temple, the concept of the temple or a house or creation is to bring order out of chaos. We know that in the description of Genesis chapter 1 that new life comes forth out of water, so that becomes important as well. That's why we see water pouring out of the temple. Also on the seventh day is another key concept. And in the ancient world, 7 always related to the completion of the temple and the inauguration of the king. And so the number 7, although we say it's a number of completion, it had everything to do with the completion of a house. And in this case, we're talking about the house of Israel being completed. And we see that go through the seed of the patriarchs and matriarchs, really starting back with Adam. Once the temple or the house was finished, then it had to be filled. And so in this case, or in creation's case, the cosmos was filled with the presence of God. We would see the same thing in the tents of the patriarchs. As new life came forth in the seed of Isaac or Jacob, and the house was completed, then it was filled with the presence of God. So the presence of God dwelled in the tents of the patriarchs. And finally, what we see in the Genesis story is that the purpose of all of this, the purpose of bringing forth seed and life, is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that is really, in its essence, what the definition of a temple is. And so we see the same pattern with the matriarchs and patriarchs. It wasn't a physical house built of stone or wood. It was seed being formed to form a house. So now when we look to the idea of the life of Sarah, it makes a little more sense, because Sarah, in essence, was building a house. Even though she died, the house continued on. Now, also in the ancient world, they would see the temple or the house as being, they pictured it as a womb, or the sanctuary was identified with a womb out of which seed would come forth. Now, when you build a house in the ancient world, one of the things you're going to have to deal with is enemies coming against the house to destroy it. And we'll just see, as you're reading through the scriptures, you understand that the reason the house was destroyed was because of idolatry. Now, that's a physical house, but it's the same thing true with the houses of the children of Israel. They were destroyed because of idolatry. And so death and separation were a result, and really the concept of death and separation meant that God's presence was no longer there. So the whole story of the Bible really is the idea of build a house, then the house destroyed, rebuilding the house, the children of Israel coming back and rebuilding their houses, etc., for the purpose of having a place where God could dwell in their midst. So I just want you to keep all that in mind as we go through these Torah portions. Now, again, I mentioned Sarah died in Hebron after the binding of Isaac. And we have this field that's being described here by Ephron, son of Zophar. And he sells the cave and the field to Abraham as a burial site for Sarah. Obviously, eventually it would be the burial site for all of the patriarchs and matriarchs, except for Rachel, who actually died when they were coming into the land. But the cave, the field, and all the trees in the field were purchased by Abraham from Ephron. This is significant because in the ancient world, these things, fields and caves and trees, were related to temples. The cave, for example, would be like the inner sanctum. The trees point us back to the garden sanctuary. The field would be the area outside the cave where they would grow food for the god. And so Abraham buried Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah next to Mamre, or next to Hebron in Canaan. This is all garden language. This is all language that takes us back to the garden sanctuary, the garden in Eden, which was the original sanctuary in which God is trying to get everything back there, the place of his presence, the place where Adam and Eve walked with him with his presence, although once they sinned, they were exited out of the garden. We see previously Abraham had been living in Ur of the Chaldees. We're not quite sure where that was. I tend to think it was in the area in the northern part of Mesopotamia. But he moves from that region, and then Lot, his nephew, they have a dispute over who's going to take the land, which land, for example. So Lot takes the plains, the flatlands, and Abraham takes the mountain at Hebron. Again, this is significant because in the ancient world, mountains were temples. And so Lot is clearly moving away from the place of the presence of God on the mountain, and he's going to the plains, which signified in the ancient world they had to build their own mountains. So in the alluvial plains of ancient Mesopotamia, they built the ziggurats, which were man-made mountains where their gods could descend from heaven. And so that's the place Lot chose to move to. Abraham, on the other hand, is moving to the place of the presence of God on the mountain. So there's a little bit of negotiating back and forth. Abraham wants to pay full price. Ephron was actually willing to give the cave and the field to Abraham. In the end, they decide on Ephron decides on the price of 400 shekels. So why 400? What is significant about that? Because Abraham was purchasing the field, if you will, in the natural world. The number 4 is always associated with things in the natural world, again related to the house. So 400, 4,000, etc. We know that the children of Israel from the time of Genesis 15 to their release from Egypt was 400 years. 400 in the natural world, or in the natural realm. And so they were enslaved and oppressed during that time. So the cave was purchased in the natural realm, but it had something very significant for the eternal realm. We'll talk about that as we go through this. The cave of Machpelah means doubles, and Hebron means companion. So it's quite interesting. So there's something here in terms of her death that has to do with a unity, with the two becoming one, where there's two and they become one. So this idea of companions and doubles, and we'll get to that towards the end of this program. Now, as we back up, there's a lot in this Torah portion. We're going to talk briefly about Rebecca, as she is going to be the bride of Isaac. So Sarah has died. Abraham has purchased the field. She is buried in that field. And now Abraham needs to find a bride for Isaac. And he doesn't want to choose a bride for Isaac in Canaan amongst the Canaanites, who are idol worshipers. He wants to find a bride for Isaac back from his own family, from his own seed, in order to continue to build the house. Again, that's important. So Abraham sends out Eliezer, his right-hand guy, his servant, his most trusted servant, and Eliezer takes with him all kinds of stuff for the bride price. Specifically, he takes camels with him, and they go back to the area called Aram Naharaim, which is the area of Padan Aram, and it is in northern Mesopotamia near Haran, and which is one of the reasons numbers of scholars think that the that's being talked about is in that region, and that Abraham really only traveled 100 miles to Haran instead of 500 miles from southern Mesopotamia. But I guess that's neither here nor there. But they go, Eliezer goes back to Aram Naharaim. It's Nahor's city, who is the brother of Abraham. And again, Eliezer took with him 10 of his master's camels. And what is interesting about camels? Well, they can hold a lot of water. And so there's something in that as we get to it. So as they go back, Eliezer is ready to offer the nose ring and bracelets, and as he meets with Rebecca at the well, she is quite excited, and she's going to take him back to her father's house. And it was interesting, tucked away in the passages, that although she's taking Eliezer back to her father's house, she ran back and told her mother from her mother's house these things. So I don't know if that implies there's a separation there, but something significant. Now, as Abraham sends Eliezer to the land, to his relatives for a wife, this is all in an effort to build up the house of God through the divine seed, if you will. So if we go back all the way to Abraham, this is the line, Adam, this is the line from Adam. What I want to stress here is that Adam, who was son of God, which is a title for king, was serving in the garden and cultivating the garden as a priest king. And the line of Adam goes all the way to the second Adam, Yeshua, and it is the line of the kings as we work our way down. And so Abraham coming from Shem, and Shem coming from Noah, and Noah coming from Adam, this is the genealogy of kings and princes. And if you will read in previous portions in Genesis about Sarah, that it was said that kings would come forth from her, as well as kings would come forth from Abraham. So again, this is the line of the kings, and this is significant to keep the dynasty within the family. So this is what's going on here. Again, I mentioned Eliezer taking the best of the master's things and bringing them to that place to secure Rebecca as the bride. Of course, he has all these camels, and they need to be refilled, and Rebecca responds to watering the camels, and it tells us that she goes down to the spring, fills her jar, and comes back up and pours the water into a trough for the camels to drink. So think about it. I mean, it's not like it was just right there and the camels drank. She had to run down to the place to a spring. Now this imagery should remind us of something that's going on back in the land, in the mountain, and that is the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring that was down below the Temple Mount. The Gihon Spring was the place where kings were crowned. The Gihon Spring was the main source of water for the city of Jerusalem and for the temple services. And so we're having a little connection here between the two, that the camels represented something similar, that he brought those camels from the land, that they contained the water. And of course, she refilled them with water from giving us a picture again of kingship down to the spring. And of course, Rebecca will be, out of her womb will come forth the kings. We could argue, remember Sarah's called princess. Her name means princess because she is royalty. And so we have the same thing with Rebecca. It's the royal seed being passed down, and we have imagery here of coronation, etc. And again, the water is poured into the trough, and she ran back up and down to get water for the camels. And Eliezer is quite clear in that Adonai, God, Adonai Tzvaot, the Lord of hosts, is the one who has guided him. Even though Abraham sent him out, it's God himself who has guided him to that place, to the house of his relatives in order to secure a bride. So we have in this story, this will be in Genesis 24, we have the whole betrothal ritual going on. Then again, the betrothal in preparation for marriage in order to build the house. And it is interesting, I don't think we consider this, but the bride could have said no. She was under no obligation to say yes. It was her decision and decision alone. So all these things that were associated with the betrothal ritual, the nose ring, the bracelets. The bracelets also, I find is interesting, is something that you have with coronations of the kings as well. So when Sarah died, it tells us in Scripture that Isaac received everything from them, from Abraham and Sarah. And what I would propose is the thing that's being communicated. Yes, he received the inheritance of the firstborn, but the key to the inheritance of the firstborn was the royal dynasty, that he received the kingship, that he would be raised up as a king. Not in the way that we see kings and monarchs ruling from their grand thrones in their great palaces. But again, this dynasty concept is very important because it takes us back to Adam, and it goes through the royal line all the way down to the second Adam, and then ultimately out to us, who are supposed to be a kingdom of priests. If the family would have refused Eliezer's request, the betrothal, Eliezer would have been freed from this oath that he made with Abraham. But of course, we know in the story that the family didn't. And so what we have in the story now is a covenant meal that is accompanying the betrothal ritual. And that took place in the ancient world. That was very common. Now, without going through all the story, ultimately, Rebecca goes back to the land with Eliezer, riding on the camel. And when she returns, she sees in the distance Isaac, and it says something interesting. It says that Isaac was meditating in the field when the camels arrive. And again, this is very classic language of a temple or house. The field being the area around the temple, the idea of meditating in the field, this concept of prayer or cultivating in the field had to do with the priesthood. And so this is giving us a picture then of the bride as Israel returning to the groom, the bridegroom, God the Father, the bridegroom Messiah, to build a house. Now, of course, as she comes near, she doesn't want Isaac to see her, and she covers herself with a veil. Again, we have imagery here of the veil in the house. In the ancient world, the tents where they dwell, the tents where the patriarchs and matriarchs dwell, always had a separation between the inner chamber where the family lived, the mother and the children, etc., and then the sort of more common or public space. There would be something between the two, just like we have in the temple, that we have a veil between that inner sanctum and then the holy place where the priest served. Of course, in the inner sanctum, only the high priest could enter into that place. But that inner sanctum was quite common in the ancient world. For the gods, after a temple was built and they set their king inside the space, the god and his consort would enter into the inner chamber, and they would produce children. So that was the purpose of the inner sanctum, was to produce life, to produce seed, and that would take place within the house or the tent. And again, all of this imagery is very much connected with the temple. Now, interestingly, Laban is like, good, this is good, she can go, and her mother, Rebekah's mother, was fine with it. But then he decides that she should stay 10 more days. So again, Rebekah's brother is Laban, who we'll later meet when Jacob goes back to the same place, Yaakov, when he's trying to get out of the land of Israel to escape his brother Esau, and his mother sends him out. He ends up going back to the same place and having to deal with his uncle Laban, his uncle Laban, who things go well at the beginning, but eventually he is the trickster and tries to prevent Jacob from leaving and trying to steal all the flocks that he had raised. So when Eliezer went back to the tent where they lived, she was there to wash his feet, to wash the feet of his men. And Laban is like, take her, go, let her become the wife for our master's son. Clearly Adonai has spoken. And along with this went articles of silver and gold and golden garments and precious gifts that were given to the brothers and the mother. And then Eliezer's saying, let us not delay. We need to hurry and return back to the land. And Rebekah is ready to go. And there's inserted in the scripture, says, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your seed possess the gate of those who hate him. Again, this idea of spreading the seed, this royal line's seed that spreads throughout the world. Ultimately, it's interesting to me, the concept of the 10-day thing, perhaps pointing to a specific period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Perhaps that's the setting. We do find that Rosh Hashanah is a coronation day, both in Israel and in the surrounding nations, that a king would be raised up on a new year. We see that in the Babylonian culture as well, but the Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, was considered the time when the king was raised up. It is the period from then until Yom Kippur, at which time that was sort of the full stage of marriage, when the two became one and entered into the honeymoon chamber. So perhaps our period of time from when Rebekah was raised up to be the bride and then they return is a picture of the 10 days in which she sees her groom when she gets back to the land, perhaps. We're not sure. As the chapter goes on, it talks about Abraham taking Keturah as his wife. She's listed in the genealogy there, and that he gave everything he had to his son Isaac, is also contained in there. The gifts went to the sons of the concubines, and then those sons were sent away from the house to where Isaac would be the master of the house. The days of Abraham were numbered at 175. And again, he was buried in the cave of Machpelah. Also listed in this particular Torah portion is the genealogy of Ishmael, who's the son of Hagar. Hagar said to be the concubine of Abraham from Egypt. And Ishmael lives 137 years. So that kind of brings us to the end of this Torah portion in terms of what's in those chapters. I just want to kind of conclude here and focus in on a couple of things. First of all, this idea of the doubles, that again, Hebron means a couple or two things that are bound together. Machpelah comes from the root kapel, which means a doubling, again, this joining together. And if you must understand that the definition of a temple, it is the place where heaven and earth meet. So in the ancient world, heaven and earth met. That was the connecting point between the two spheres at a temple, where a temple was built. And so now we can see this imagery in this place of the cave. Remember, I talked about how the cave represented the inner chamber. It's the place of the joining. Of course, they were separated in the flesh when they died and they were buried. They were separated from God, separated from one another, separated between their life and buried in the earth. But yet this place, Hebron, Machpelah, was considered by the sages to be the entrance to Gan Eden, or the Garden in Eden. It was the place of the joining. So at a time when heaven and earth would come together, would be reunited and be restored as one, as it was before creation, then too not only individually body and soul would be raised up and reunited, but also the king and the queen, as in Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob, and in this case Leah, would be raised up, because it's all about building the house. Again, I can't emphasize that more, that the key to all this is the king would be the ruler over the house, and his royal seed would expand the house. And this is exactly what's being said in the creation week: to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth was the responsibility of the king, to spread out to the four corners of the earth and to be a benevolent ruler and to bring prosperity and blessing to the land in which he ruled over. And so I mentioned early on, in the natural world, anytime we see the language of 440, 400, 4,000, etc., we're talking about house building in the natural world. So seed coming forth out of the womb of a woman and producing a child, a real child. But at the same time, we see the number one always has to do with house building in the eternal world. And house building in the eternal world is the two becoming one. So we see this in the marriage. This relates to what we've seen here in Eliezer securing a bride, Rebekah, for Isaac, and pointing us to the burial place. All of these things tucked into the same Torah portion, but in that the two become one, in particular, that the heavens and the earth would become one. So the temple is in effect an overlay of these two realms, a double, the natural world and the eternal world. We have the double cave, the entrance to the garden, and we have four couples buried in that place that will be raised up to rule and reign. And I just close out with that it says in some of the writings that the fragrance of the cave refreshed Abraham's spirit and restored all things. So thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.